want to be careful about how I describe what happened on Altamont Street because the temptation is to start with the strangeness, and that would be dishonest. The strangeness came later. What came first was me, in a duplex I could barely afford, in Covington, Kentucky, the 6 weeks after a divorce I did not want, eating cereal out of a saucepan because I had not yet bought bowls. I should say what the duplex was. It was half a house. Built in 1951, wood frame, shared center wall, 2 mirror image units with separate entrances on a residential block 3 streets up from the river. My side was the left. The other side was the right. I had a kitchen, a front room, a bedroom, and a bathroom I could almost touch both walls of. My neighbor on the other side of the shared wall had the same. I could hear him. He could hear me. And this is the ordinary price of cheap housing, and I paid it without complaint. Because I had spent 14 years in a 4-bedroom colonial in Erlanger with a woman who had stopped speaking to me in year 11. And the sound of another human being moving through a wall was, for a while, a comfort. His name was Dennis Kazmierski. I know this because it was on his mailbox, and because we spoke exactly once during my first week, when we both happened to be retrieving mail at the same time. He was in his late 50s, short, clean-shaven, wearing a brown canvas jacket. He worked at a CVS distribution warehouse, he said, and had lived in the unit for 4 years. He did not ask what I did. He said, "Welcome," and went inside. I never saw him again. I heard him, though, every day. The walls in that duplex were not insulated in any modern sense. Here there was the original plaster, the lath, and maybe 2 inches of dead air, and then his plaster. I could hear his television, his microwave, his footsteps in the kitchen, which shared the wall with my kitchen. I could hear him run the faucet at night before bed, always around 10:15. I could hear him set something down on what I assumed was a counter, a dull, flat sound, once, every night. I assumed it was his phone. I could hear the particular rhythm of his mornings, alarm, bathroom, kitchen, front door. It became a kind of clock. Not unpleasant. I will tell you the first moment, and I will describe it exactly because I've gone over it many times, and I want you to understand that I am not constructing this from hindsight. It was a Thursday in March. I had been in the duplex for about 3 weeks, and I was in the kitchen making coffee. I used a French press. It was one of the 4 things I took from the house. And I heard, through the wall, the sound of a French press being depressed. The particular low grinding resistance of the plunger going through coarse grounds. I stopped. I heard the sound finish. Then I pressed mine. I am aware of how this reads. 2 men in adjacent kitchens making coffee at the same time. It is not unusual. It is not even interesting. I would not be telling you about it if it were the only time. The next morning, Friday, I woke at 6:12. Not to an alarm. I simply woke. And through the wall, I heard Dennis's kitchen sounds. Already underway, coffee cabinet. Something set down on the counter. Then about 90 seconds later, I followed the same sequence. My own coffee, my own cabinet. My own phone set on the counter by the stove, where I always put it. I noticed the correspondence, but I filed it under coincidence, which is where all of this lived for the first week. On Saturday, I slept late until almost 9. I woke to silence. His side was quiet. I lay in bed for 20 minutes, then got up and went to the kitchen. I started the electric kettle. On Saturdays, I made tea, not coffee, a habit I'd had since college that had survived the marriage. As the kettle heated, I heard, through the wall, Dennis's kettle, or what sounded like a kettle, click off. His had boiled first. I had not heard it start. On Sunday, I paid attention. I sat in the kitchen with a notebook. I am a person who writes things down, which is the only reason I can reconstruct this with any precision. And I logged the sounds from his side and my own actions, with times. What I found was this: every significant domestic action I performed that morning, running the faucet, opening the refrigerator, sitting down in the front room, turning on the television, was preceded by the corresponding sound from his side of the wall, by an interval of between 45 seconds and 3 minutes. Not every action, not the trivial ones, not shifting my weight or scratching my arm, the structural actions, the ones that, if you were describing your morning to someone, you would mention. I want to be honest about my mental state. I was not well. I was sleeping poorly. I was eating badly. I was in the acute phase of a grief I had not yet named as grief. Works because I was still calling it relief. I was aware even then that a newly divorced man sitting alone in a kitchen with a notebook, monitoring the sounds through his wall, was not a portrait of stability. I considered the possibility that I was projecting structure onto randomness, which is a thing that lonely, pattern-seeking, recently abandoned people do. So I tested it. On Monday morning, I did something I'd never done in the duplex. I got up at 5 a.m., earlier than I'd ever risen there, and went to the kitchen and stood still. I waited. Nothing from the other side. Silence. At 5:14, I took a mixing bowl from the cabinet, the largest one, and dropped it on the linoleum floor. It made a sound like a bell being punched. I'd never dropped a mixing bowl in this kitchen before. There was no pattern to precede. When through the wall from his kitchen, I heard a heavy round object strike the floor. Not after, not simultaneously. I heard it before I let go of the bowl. By maybe a second, maybe less. I had the bowl in my hand. I was holding it at chest height, and through the wall came the sound of the impact. And then my fingers opened. I stood there for a long time. Here is what I need you to understand, and what I spent the next several weeks trying to disprove. The sounds from the other side were not following me. They were not echoing me. They were preceding me by a shrinking interval that I could track and measure. And every attempt I made to act unpredictably only confirmed that whatever was on the other side had already accounted for my deviation. I tried to break the sequence 7 times in the first 2 weeks after the bowl, and I will describe 4. On the first attempt, I resolved to leave the duplex immediately after waking and not return until evening, performing no domestic actions at all. I woke at 6:40. Through the wall, silence. I got dressed, walked to the front door, opened it. As I stepped onto the porch, I heard, through the still open door, his front door close. He had left first. By the time I got home at 8 p.m., I could hear through the wall that his television was already on. The same channel I turned to every night, a local news broadcast I watched out of habit. His had been on for an estimated 12 minutes before I touched my remote. On the second attempt, I decided to cook something I had never cooked. I drove to Kroger and bought a pork loin, rosemary, and garlic. Ingredients I had no history with and no recipe for. I was improvising. In the kitchen, I began breaking down the garlic. Through the wall, I heard the rhythmic, papery sound of garlic being peeled, already underway. I stopped. His sounds continued for another 30 seconds, then stopped. I resumed. His resumed, ahead of mine. I finished the meal. It took 40 minutes. His sounds ended 38 minutes before mine did, because by that point, the interval had compressed from 90 seconds to approximately 2 minutes of total lead. I am aware the math on that seems contradictory. I'll come back to it. On the third attempt, I did nothing. I sat in the front room From 7 a.m. to 11 a.m., without moving, without eating, without turning anything on, I sat in a chair and breathed. Through the wall. Silence. 4 hours of perfect silence. This should have been a relief. It was not. And because at 11:03 I stood up to use the bathroom, and I had to, physically, there was no decision involved. And as I rose from the chair, I heard through the wall a toilet flush. He had already gone. My body's need had been anticipated. On the fourth attempt, and this is the one I return to most often, I acted on pure impulse. No plan. I was standing in the kitchen at 2 p.m, and I picked up the saucepan I ate cereal from and threw it at the wall. Not at his wall, at the exterior wall, the one facing the street. I threw it hard and it dented the plaster and clattered to the floor, and I stood there breathing and I waited. Nothing. No corresponding sound. 30 seconds. A minute. Then, from his side, I heard the sound of a saucepan being set down gently on a counter. Not thrown. Set down. As if it had already been picked up, already been held, and had been put down calmly, the way you set something down when you've decided not to throw it. He had done the calmer version of my action before I did the violent one. As if the throw had been one of several options, and he had taken the one I would have taken if I'd had one more second of composure. I started sleeping badly after that. Not because of the sounds. He was quiet at night, or rather, his nighttime sounds matched the rhythm of someone who goes to bed when I go to bed and sleeps when I sleep. I slept badly because I could not stop thinking about the interval. The gap between his version and mine. And the gap was closing. In the first week of noticing, the lead time had been roughly 90 seconds to 3 minutes. By the end of March, it was 60 to 90 seconds. By mid-April, it was 30 to 60. I kept the notebook. I logged the times. The compression was not linear, it moved in a slight curve, decelerating as it approached zero, like a function with an asymptote. I had taken enough math in college to recognize the shape. It was not going to reach zero, it was going to approach zero forever, halving and halving and halving, getting closer without arriving, unless the curve changed. I want to talk about Dennis Kazmierski. The real one. Because I did eventually try to address this with him, and what happened is important. On April 9th, a Saturday, I knocked on his door. I stood on his side of the porch and knocked. No answer. I knocked again. I could hear faintly sounds from inside. A television maybe, or something electrical. I knocked a third time. Nothing. I went back to my side. Usually on April 14th, I tried again. Same result. I wrote him a note and put it in his mailbox. Hi Dennis, your neighbor, Unit A. Would like to talk briefly about the shared wall. No complaints. Just want to introduce myself properly. Gavin. The note was still in his mailbox 4 days later. On April 20th, I called the landlord. Her name was Patty Overbeck, and she managed this duplex and 2 others on the same block. I asked if Dennis was traveling. She said she didn't think so. I asked if she'd heard from him recently. She said rent was paid automatically through a bank draft, and she didn't tend to hear from tenants unless something was broken. I told her I hadn't seen him in weeks. She said that was normal for him. He's a quiet one, she said, and I could hear in her voice that she considered this a virtue. And I didn't tell Patty about the sounds. I didn't tell anyone. I want to be clear about why. It was not because I feared being disbelieved. It was because the only way to describe what was happening required me to say something I was not yet willing to say, which was, the person on the other side of my wall is living my life before I live it, and the distance between his version and mine is shrinking. Spoken aloud, That sentence has only one destination, and it is a psychiatrist's office. I was not ready to go there, not because I didn't think I might need to, but because I was still collecting data, and the data was consistent. And I have never in my life been able to stop collecting data before the pattern resolves. My ex-wife could have told you this about me. It is the quality she found most intolerable. Not that I analyze things, but that I couldn't stop analyzing things even when analysis was causing harm. She once told me during the last year that I would watch our marriage die and take notes on the rate of decay. She was correct. I did exactly that. I have the notebook. In May, the interval dropped below 30 seconds. I could feel it now, not just hear it. I would reach for a glass and feel the reach already completed. Not in my muscles, but as in the air, as if the air had already been parted by an arm. I would open a door and the door would feel like it was closing. Not resistance. Lag. As if every action I took was the second performance of something already executed on the other side of a wall I could not see through. I started to wonder if I was the one who was behind. This thought arrived on May 11th at 3 a.m, and once it arrived, it would not leave. The premise I had been operating under was that Dennis, or whatever was producing sounds on his side, was doing things before I did them. But the structure was symmetrical. If you are standing at the wall and you hear a version of your action performed 1 second before yours, you can describe that 2 ways. He did it first, or I did it second. And if I did it second, then the question is not, how does he know what I'm going to do? The question is, why am I doing what he already did? I am telling you this not as a philosophical exercise, but because the shift in framing changed what I was afraid of. I had been afraid of being predicted. After May 11th, I was afraid of being redundant, of being the echo, not the source, of the possibility that the life I was living and the coffee, the meals, in the television, the showers, the small domestic acts that constituted the entirety of my post-divorce existence was not mine, was a copy, was the vibration that reaches the far end of a string after the note has already been played. The interval continued to close. By late May, it was under 10 seconds. I could sit in my kitchen and hear, through the wall, the sound of my next action. And in the time it took for that sound to register in my brain, my body would already be performing it. The two were converging, approaching synchronization. I lost the ability to surprise myself. That's the best way I can describe the feeling. You know the experience of acting on impulse, of saying something you didn't plan to say, or picking up the phone and calling someone you hadn't thought about. In that capacity requires a gap between intention and action, a space where the decision hasn't been made yet. That gap was being colonized, not by Dennis, not by anything from outside, by the simple annihilating knowledge that whatever I was about to do was already underway on the other side of the wall, and that my version of it was the redundant one. On June 3rd, I stopped keeping the notebook. Not because the pattern had changed, but because I opened the notebook to write an entry and heard, through the wall, the sound of a pen being set down. He had already finished writing. I was going to write what had already been written. The notebook, which had been my only instrument of control, my only way of asserting that I was the one observing, the one analyzing, the one who would determine what this meant, was inside the pattern and thought my note-taking had been preceded. My analysis had been anticipated. The part of me that watches was being watched first. I need to tell you about June 7th. On June 7th, at approximately 2 p.m, I was sitting in the front room. The interval by my last measurement 2 days earlier was under 3 seconds. I was not doing anything, I was sitting. Through the wall, I heard sitting. Not a sound exactly. The particular quality of silence that a room has when someone is in it and not moving. His silence and my silence were almost identical, separated by less time than it takes to blink. I stood up. Through the wall, the sound of standing. Simultaneous, not before, not after. The same moment. I walked to the kitchen. His footsteps and mine were synchronous. I reached for the faucet, which the faucet sound came from both sides of the wall at once. I turned the water off. Both faucets stopped. The interval had reached 0. I stood at the wall and put my hand on it. The plaster was cool. I pressed my palm flat against it and I held it there and I listened, and what I heard was not a corresponding hand pressing from the other side. What I heard was nothing. Because there was no gap left, there was no other side performing my actions before me or after me or at the same time. There was just the action occurring once in a space that no longer had a boundary where I ended and the wall began. I could feel the kitchen on the other side. Not hear it, feel it. The counter was in the same place mine was, because the units were mirror images. But the feeling was not of a mirrored room. It was of a room continuous with mine, as if the wall were not a division but a fold, 2 pages lying flat against each other, and I was the ink that had soaked through. I called Patty Overbeck. I told her I needed to get into the other unit. I told her I had not seen Dennis in months, and I was concerned. She sighed and said she would come by tomorrow. I said it needed to be today. She said she didn't have the key on her. It was at her office in Florence. I said I would meet her there. She said tomorrow. She said it in the voice of a person who manages rental properties and has learned that urgency is almost always someone else's anxiety. I waited until dark. Then I went to his front door with a flathead screwdriver and a pry bar I'd bought at the hardware store on Pike Street. The door was a 1950s original with a simple deadbolt. It took me 4 minutes. And I am not proud of this. I am telling you what I did. I opened the door and stepped inside and turned on the light. The unit was furnished. A couch, a television, a small table, shoes by the door, a jacket on a hook. The kitchen. I walked there directly because the kitchen was where the wall was, the wall I had been listening through for 3 months. Had dishes in the drying rack, a coffee mug on the counter, a French press, identical to mine, sitting beside the stove with grounds still in it. The grounds were damp. The place smelled lived in, not abandoned, not stale. It smelled like coffee and dish soap and the particular human scent of a space someone occupies daily. I checked the bathroom. Toothbrush in the holder, towel on the rack, slightly damp. I checked the bedroom. Bed made. A book on the nightstand, a Robert Parker paperback, dog-eared halfway through. I checked every room. I opened every closet. I looked under the bed and behind the shower curtain and in the kitchen pantry. There was no one in the unit. There was no indication that anyone had left recently. There was no indication that anyone had been absent. The space was perfectly maintained in the present tense of a life being lived, and the person living it was not there. Had not been there, as far as I could verify, for the entire duration of my residency. Patty confirmed the next day that she had not seen Dennis since January and that his automatic payments had continued without interruption. I stood in his kitchen, on his side of the wall, and I put my hand on the plaster. From my side, through the wall, I heard nothing, because I was not on my side. I was here, and here and there had for one night been separated again. I went back to my unit. I closed his door as well as I could. I sat in my kitchen in the dark. Through the wall from his side, the sound of a man sitting in a kitchen in the dark. The interval was already back. Maybe 5 seconds. Growing again. Or shrinking again. I couldn't tell the direction. I moved out on June 11th. I did not give 30 days notice. I forfeited my deposit. I packed my 4 things in the notebooks, and I drove to my brother's house in Lexington, and I slept on his couch for 3 weeks. And I did not explain why, and he did not ask. Because we are that kind of family, here's what I need to tell you before I stop. In Lexington, at my brother's house, I slept on the couch. The couch was against a wall. Yes, on the other side of that wall was the garage. The garage was unheated, unfinished, and used for storage. No one went in there. On the 3rd night at 2 a.m, I lay on the couch and listened. Through the wall, the sound of someone breathing. Not asleep, just resting. Just present. Breathing at exactly my rhythm, separated from my breath, by an interval I could measure if I wanted to. I did not measure it. I did not open the notebook. I did not get up and go into the garage. I lay there in the dark on my brother's couch and I breathed. And the breathing on the other side of the wall breathed with me almost at the same time, not quite approaching. I have moved 4 times since June. Each time the wall is different. An apartment in Lexington, a rental in Georgetown, a room I sublet in Cincinnati for 2 months, now a place in Dayton, a studio, no shared walls. No shared walls, I made sure of it. Top floor, corner unit, no one above, no one beside. The exterior walls face a parking lot and an alley. There is no adjacent occupied space, but there are walls. There are always walls. And last night, in the studio in Dayton at 3 a.m., I put my hand against the exterior wall, the one facing the alley, the one with nothing behind it but brick and air, and then more air, and then the fence around the parking lot. And I felt it, not a sound, not a vibration, a recognition. The sensation of a hand meeting mine from the other side of a surface that should not have another side. The faintest pressure. Warm. Patient. The interval, if I had to guess, is about 60 seconds, which means it's starting over, which means the convergence is not tied to a place. It's tied to me. Wherever I go, there will be a wall. And on the other side of the wall, there will be a life that matches mine, running slightly ahead, and the gap will close. And on the night it reaches 0, I will feel the fold again. The sensation that I am not separated from the other side, but continuous with it. That I am the ink soaked through the page. That the wall is not a boundary, but a seam. I do not know what happens when the seam opens. I know this. In Covington, when the interval hit 0, I felt no fear. I felt no cold, no malice, no wrongness. What I felt was the absence of redundancy. The sensation of a life being lived once instead of twice. A single set of footsteps instead of a pair. It was not threatening. It was, and I need to say this even though it sounds wrong, it was efficient. Like a correction. Like a draft being replaced by a final version. And I am not sure I am the final version. I am in Dayton. The studio has no shared walls. But last night, with my hand on the brick, the interval was 60 seconds, and this morning it was 54. The math is the same. The curve is the same. The asymptote is 0, and the approach is relentless, and the only variable is time. I have started leaving my hand on the wall for longer than I should. Not to measure, not to analyze. Because when I press my palm flat against the surface and I feel that faint, warm, answering pressure, it is the first time since my marriage ended that I have felt, with certainty, that someone is on the other side. And I know this, that the correct response is to pull my hand away. I am not pulling my hand away.